All right, and we're live. Welcome everybody. I've taken over Craig Reed's channel right now. He's like hiding off in the car, hiding from his wife. So he's still like partially in the chat too, so he can say hi. But I'm here with Dry Apologist or Caleb, and I don't know. We were kind of like going back and trying to figure out what channel we were gonna talk on since I know you've had a couple streams, Caleb, on some of the different arguments for God's existence, and I think in the comments or something like that we had discussed a little bit of the moral argument. And excuse me. And I think I've got, I don't know, for myself, I almost feel like I've got kind of a unique position in that I'm unsure if, like, while I am a theist, I'm I guess unsure if moral realism is actually true, in that I don't think that moral claims or propositions have some sort of like independent truth aptness to them, in that, like, I'm reading Ruth Schaefer Landau's book right now on moral realism, and the reason for that is, I guess, sort of for theological purposes in some sense. So I myself am open to moral realism. It's just that right now it's kind of a hurdle for me, in that I think that if I were to accept it, it would carry certain implications that would, I don't know, like I can think of sort of this moral argument against God's existence if moral facts can exist independent. So I think it would go something like, if there's a certain moral fact that is dependent upon God's nature, then God would be unable to perform any action in which the breaking of that moral fact would occur. And we live in a world in which some moral fact, let's say rape is wrong, does occur. That would be like an instance of rape occurring. Therefore, the moral arbiter to the fact, rape is wrong, did not create the world itself. I kind of threw that in a sort of weird position, but it's something like, if there's certain moral facts that are dependent upon God's nature, then God would not be able to create any world in which these facts were able to be broken. Something like that. That's kind of like how I sort of see the moral argument against God's existence, that as I've kind of thought about it somewhat.
Okay. Well, let me make sure I understand. So are you saying the problem is because God wouldn't be able to violate the facts, or are you saying that no being would be able to?
Right. So if the moral facts are non-indexed, in that, like, every being, if it's to be considered a moral being, must comply with these facts, then that would mean that God, being a being that created a world in which these facts could be broken, would be considered an immoral being in some sense. So the fact that God creates a world in which rape can occur is I guess, indication that rape should not occur, is not a fact that exists within God's nature. Otherwise, God wouldn't create such a world.
Okay, so it's a kind of like argument against, okay, so maybe if we could break that down, because to me, that argument...
It's a problem of evil argument.
Yeah, to me, that seems like a version of the problem. Like, we could set aside moral facts and you could still present that as a version of the problem of evil. And then I would give a, response like I do to the problem of evil. But to me, the fact that there are moral, or if we're going to take that there are moral facts or moral truths, I mean, God could have sufficient reason for allowing people to have latitude in how they use their free will and so on. So I don't think God would be bound to creating a world in which, because I mean, what is your alternative? That there are no moral truths, so God then has more latitude in how he creates the world, and then we're just operating under the idea that there are these moral facts, and then there aren't moral facts. I mean, like I find the idea that there are moral facts and God allows people to go against those to be much more plausible than what you're suggesting. Like,
Sure.
I don't see a reason to connect the dots like you've done.
Yeah, well, I can see a way in which moral facts can still occur, but they're not, I guess, universal in some sense. That like they're they're only effective or aimed towards certain creatures, like namely creatures that are capable of fulfilling those moral facts, such as like say you ought to give to charity or something like that. This is a moral fact that would only exist for people that have some sort of income capacity. Like I wouldn't say that that moral fact would apply to young children who have no jobs or anything like that. And so that would be an instance that I would say like an indexed moral claim, where it's only specific to certain creatures that are capable of doing so. And so I would say that there could be like moral facts that are exclusively relevant to, say, all people or even certain specific people. Like I would say like the Mosaic covenant would be some sort of like set of moral facts that would be I guess, I don't know, put on or like some sort of obligation that was made between the people of that time period that would no longer really I don't know, apply to other people. Like that would be a way in which I could still save moral facts in some sense, but they're facts that are purely constructed by God or by other beings, I would say.
Well, but then they're not really moral facts. I mean, like that's just a contingent moral proposition. Like, I mean, you would then be suggesting it's only wrong because God has put that in place for that time, but there's nothing intrinsically wrong about murder, or so on. Any example we want to give, there's nothing intrinsically wrong about it. It's just that that's just been put in place at that time. But that just strikes us as really as insufficient. I mean, that's a kind of relativism, you know.
Right. Yeah. I would say this is some sort of form of constructivism in the same way that like a king could create some sort of ruling for his domain that he has, that like, I don't know, 1/10 of all your income goes to me through taxes. That would be some sort of like moral fact in regards to that domain because the king declared it to be so. In the same sort of way, if you created a world in which you governed all of the laws of nature or things like that, you have the capacity to sort of create any sort of moral laws or dictates for the people and creatures within that world.
Yeah. Well, to me, that's in some ways that's kind of how some versions of like natural law argue for morality, that it's based on the certain ends that God has put in place. So like natural law theorists, not all of them necessarily, but will argue that moral facts are grounded within the type of the natures of the type of beings that God's created. And then they'll argue, well, that's how you can get around this sort of Euthyphro problem. But the difficulty with that, I don't buy that approach, is because it ultimately leads to some kind of relativism or constructivism. Like if God had created us to be cannibals, it would be moral for us to then be cannibals. And it's just like, that just takes all the thrust out of any sort of moral statement at that point. Like, and you might say, well, God wouldn't do that. But it's like, well, why not? I mean, it just opens that question.
Let me.
Yeah, go ahead, Craig.
Can you guys hear me? Okay. Before we go further down that, let's clarify. Do you use the moral argument for God? And
I don't think either of us really do.
This whole subject, moral. You're probably a moral realist. I was asking Dry Apologist.
I don't use the moral argument.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Can you hear us, Craig? Yeah, we can hear you. I used to use.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I used to use the moral argument, but I don't think that it works. So, because I think if you accept moral truth, it ends up becoming like the tag argument, like we talked about, last week.
Right.
If they're moral truths, I think they're necessary truths, and I do believe that. But necessary truths don't need any grounding. But if you say they aren't necessary truths, then that takes the whole thrust out of the argument. So then you have to recast the argument as a moral knowledge argument, like I discussed with Ben Watkins, that it has to, so then it's more like, well, we wouldn't have had this moral knowledge if it wasn't for God, which you could argue that. I'm not convinced that that's a foolproof argument, but it takes away this sort of deductive nature of the moral argument. So,
well, did you watch, for example, the recent debate with Matt Dillahunty and David Wood? Did either of you guys see that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I mean, I thought that really didn't work in that context.
Right. Well, that was, to me, that was more of like arguing from consequences, more of that debate, but they kind of cross back and forth between like moral ontology and like societal consequences, I felt like. But yeah, I don't think I think it's better to just argue for moral realism and not argue that God is necessary for that. I think that makes more headway in talking to non-believers, because I think a lot of times there's a hang up from the atheist community that they have to be moral relativists because they're afraid that the moral argument will thereby commit them to God's existence, which, and I'm not saying they all argue that way, nor am I saying that that would be a sound way to reason, but maybe they're kind of suspicious of the argument. And the thing is, it doesn't deductively follow. So it's like, just get people to accept moral realism and then maybe focus on a different, I mean, I guess if the argument did work, then sure, go ahead and argue it. I just don't think it works. And I think it's, it's just better. It makes better headway to just acknowledge. But not everybody, most theists are going to disagree with me. I ran a poll on Twitter, and, the best general argument for God's existence, the majority voted, the moral or reason type argument. I mean, that was what, or not the majority, but the highest percentage voted for that. So I think a lot, and I imagine that within that category, most of those people who voted were theists. I think some atheists probably gave some votes for the cosmological and so on, but I think probably very few atheists went with the moral argument in that poll. Anyways.
Yeah, I know some atheists that have actually like converted to Christianity due to the moral argument, and that like I guess they figured that naturalism wasn't enough to sort of support the moral claims that they held to. Yeah, go ahead, Craig.
Well, I totally agree with what he just said in terms of it does naturally follow, and that's why a lot of atheists are knee-jerk moral subjectivists, because they think that they're convincing themselves to a theist because so many people have argued exist, therefore God exists. But Dillahunty and Sam Harris were becoming moral realist kind of, and basing it on different framings like consequentialism. I thought that was actually a good development.
Mm-hmm.
Because ultimately, if more, go ahead.
It's kind of fascinating how, like, I know for quite a while people were kind of unwilling to move towards the moral realist camp because they figured that it has certain implications towards God's existence. But I think lately within philosophy, there's sort of a move back to that, especially like I think a majority of philosophers, despite being atheists, are moral realists. And whether there are moral realists in the sense of, say, like Matt Dillahunty or Sam Harris, which I think would actually technically qualify as a moral constructivist in some sense, or as somebody like Rocher Landau or Thomas Nagel, or even Peter Singer now, I think, as moral Platonists in some sense. I think that's sort of the more philosophic approach for morality within the modern atheist movement.
Yeah, and to me, like the moral argument.
So you said you're not convinced that you're a moral realist? Go ahead.
Right. I would say that I'm, as of right now, a moral constructivist. So I actually laid out sort of a rendition of the moral argument in response to Caleb here on his Twitter, and I was sort of laying out the constructivist argument for moral facts or moral prescriptions, and that like if a moral prescription exists, then there must be a moral prescriber moral prescriptions do exist. We humans are not the moral prescribers, therefore there must be some sort of non-human moral prescriber that, and if we wanted to say that the moral prescriptions do not change, then it would have to be some sort of unchanging moral prescriber. So you can argue that the non-human moral prescriber is God, or you could argue maybe it's some sort of like aspect of nature, I guess. But if the moral prescriptions themselves are rational in that they carry some sort of like, I don't know, cognitive position, and they have some sort of ability to pass judgment, then it seems you're much more likely to be describing some sort of agent. Now, I had people in the responses sort of taking issue with each of the premises there, like some saying that, no, the prescribers are actually humans, it's all socially constructive. And then I had others like that were taking the more moral realist position that you can have moral prescriptions without actually having any sort of moral prescriber. And I think one of the limitations there is that if you have moral facts that exist, these moral facts, like one of the implications, I think, to moral realism is that you can have moral facts or moral obligations to perform certain actions or to refrain from performing certain actions, that you yourself have no capacity to perform that action or to refrain from that action. So let's say, like if it was the case that the moral prescription was you ought to care for your children or raise up your children well, something like that, and you happen to die in some sort of war or something like that, then that would mean that, like, while you had every intention of caring for your children and raising them up well, you had no capacity to fulfill that obligation. But the moral realist would, I think, be beholden to the position that while it was the case that he had no capacity to fulfill his obligation, nonetheless, he was still obligated to do so, which seems to me like quite strange that there are certain actions that we're incapable of performing that we have an obligation to perform.
Is this your argument? Because I know you pose this as an argument against determinism, but are you proposing this as an argument against moral facts altogether?
Yes, yeah, I use it for both, really. This is drawing somewhat, I guess, from Kant's ought implies can. And so if moral realism is true, I believe that like certain moral facts that sort of exist out there as sort of obligations for everybody. So let's take like cannibalism. You ought not to eat your own child. Now, there are plenty of animals that exist right now that say the child dies through natural means, and they will eat that child in order to regain the nourishment. Like that happens pretty regularly within cats. Like if they have a batch of kittens, one of them dies, they might eat that along with the placenta in order to recover enough nutrients for feeding the rest of the children. And so if it was some sort of moral fact that cannibalism is wrong, one ought not to eat one's own child, then all throughout nature, this moral fact is being broken all the time. Now, it might be the case that a moral realist will say, no, these moral facts only apply to rational creatures, such as humans, which seems to me just similar to like what I was saying, that moral facts only are in regards to certain people at certain time periods. A same sort of delineation of like which people these moral facts apply to and which ones they don't. Like say, if it only applies to humans, why is it just humans instead of like just specific humans?
Okay, so I get the thing about the animals, and yeah, I think a lot of moral realists would say, well, if the animal isn't capable, they're not, I mean, there is no ought
They're
if
not
they
conscious.
really can't.
Right.
Right, but they don't have the same level of consciousness or rationality. But let's just say that they are violating a moral fact. I mean, to me,
Also, they would make a differentiation between nature is amoral. You know, a lion eats a zebra. There's no crime being committed. The lion didn't murder the zebra. The lion's just doing what he does.
I
So
would hold to
there's
that,
no
but I don't know if moral realists would have to
Well-
hold to that as well.
Well, let's just take it at its strongest point. Let's just say that that's immoral. I mean, there's certainly something that seems disordered about it, but let's just say that it's something that's also immoral. I mean, to me, I'm not convinced by the idea that, I mean, something can be a moral like there can be a moral fact. A moral fact is something that's abstract. I mean, to me, that it is just distinct from nature. Now, because
right. Totally.
I'm a theist, I think that, you know, God is going to, you know, hold nature, what goes on, accountable, what we do. But like, just from the pure philosophical sense, to me, there can be there's no contradiction. There being moral facts, and people can't fulfill them, strictly speaking. So, I mean, to me, they're intertwined. I mean, you don't have an obligation if you literally can't fulfill it. But let's just say that you did. I'm not convinced that that would even be a problem for moral facts, because to me, the two are distinct.
Yeah, so there's this thing that it seems like there's sort of these two camps within moral realism. There are the moral realists that hold to sort of like there are evaluative differences between states of affairs, and then there are the moral realists that say that there are specific like duties, like sort of a proposition, or all people ought to be benevolent towards one another, something like that, as a sort of propositional fact that exists in sort of a Platonic realm as some sort of duty. Now there's what is it? Scott Berman, I think he's a Neoplatonist. He had a discussion with Alex Malpass on his podcast Thoughtology, and he's I guess a moral realist, but he's a Platonist and believes that there are better and worse states of affairs. And so he might say that it's better, say, a world it's better, a world without rape occurring is better than a world in which rape does occur, and that would be sort of the difference. But he's not saying that one ought not to rape. That would be sort of a duty that is not existent, I guess, within his moral ontology. There would just be the evaluative differences between things. And I do think that argument certainly works. Like I think that's a way in which moral realism can exist. Yeah, go ahead, Craig.
That's kind of where the entire atheist community is that guy an atheist, I take it? Because that's where the entire atheist community is starting to head, because actually Matt Dillahunty uses the chess analogy that everybody hates, but I actually think it works. If your goal is to win the game of chess, there are better moves for winning your goal game. And you can apply that same logic to human society. If your goal is to have healthy, functioning society with called moral actions that are going to help you produce that goal, that are obviously, and then Einstein did this thing, was like, yeah, 2 + 2, all right, 2 + 2 does not equal 7, but that's a better and 12. And just because we don't have the absolute moral truth, we don't.
Yeah. I think I was kind of getting what you were saying there.
And once you start getting atheism,
Yeah. Okay. You're kind of cutting in and out there, but yeah, I see kind of what you're saying. Like Matt Dillahunty, and I'd say Sam Harris as well, who's explicitly a determinist, states that there are no oughts for like obligations for how to behave, but there are better and worse ways of like existing, either coming closer or further away from eudaimonia, or increasing the amount of well-being in the world, or decreasing the amount of suffering in the world, something sort of like that.
Or
so
even just
when
the basic functioning of society.
Yeah.
Well-being is the word that throws everybody off because it sounds so lame.
Right. So I think
a functioning society, you need people to have,
Right. So I think the moral argument that I'm sort of attacking, or the moral position that I'm sort of attacking, is the moral realist position in regards to duties, which it is. I don't know. At least Ruth Schaefer Lando, he seems like he holds that there are duties. I know. I was talking to Wellen, I think, or no, Mark something on Twitter, and he sort of holds to that same position as well. And so I think that's the moral realist position that I think I come in conflict with.
So your objection or your difficulty then is about obligations then? Is that right? I mean, are you okay with values, but your difficulties with obligations?
Yeah. Because I think if the obligations stand, I guess, independent to any sort of obligator or prescriber, then I would think that would like force God into some sort of a position where he'd be unable to create a world in which any of these obligations fail to be enacted. So
yeah, I don't see why that would, I don't see why that would necessarily follow. I mean, I know that was what you presented earlier, but I'm just not convinced by this. I mean, isn't it pretty, I mean, to me, it seems perfectly coherent that God creates a world in which people have free will and they can choose to act on these moral obligations or not. And you could even argue that God has a moral obligation to create that type of world if you wanted. So I just don't see the problem here.
Okay, so maybe you're right. Maybe I'm the way I'm, I guess, thinking of it is not in regards to any sort of obligation towards people, but rather, I guess, like some sort of independent fact as an obligation. So let's say it's not. Let's say it's the case that in what is it? Infanticide is wrong. There's a way in which you could phrase that as any instance in which infanticide occurs is something which ought to be refrained from, or like any cause of infanticide would make the causer immoral. So if that's what we mean by like moral facts in some sense, then I would think God being the ultimate cause to all things would. And if there's an instance in which infanticide occurs, God would then be immoral from that. Excuse me.
But why does that follow? I mean, that last part where you put in, like, why does that follow?
Yeah. So, if a cause leads to the effect of infanticide occurring, then the causer would be immoral. Then God being the cause of the world in which infanticide does occur, God would then be immoral. I think that's sort of the argument that would be made there.
So God would be immoral for creating a world in which there can be infanticide.
Yeah.
But what if God has a moral and I'm not arguing this necessarily is the case, but what if God has a moral obligation to create that kind of world, and it supersedes this other moral obligation that we would have to not carry that out? I mean, that's at least possible.
That seems like you would have to have some sort of hierarchy of obligations there, which I'm not sure if that would work within a realm of like purely Platonic moral facts.
Why not? Why not? Because we do have obligations. There is a hierarchy. I mean, don't you think that? I mean, I would say it's plausible to say you have an obligation to not lie unless it's to protect somebody's life. Now, not everybody's going to agree with that, but that's a plausible hierarchy.
Right. So I think the moral realist would say that it is wrong to lie, and it is also wrong to allow people to be murdered. And so any instance in which you either let somebody be murdered or you lie, that would be you would be performing some sort of immoral action. I don't know if you've listened to Tom Jump at all, but he sort of says that like even if you were to push a child out of the way of a moving train, that would be immoral because you're pushing the kid there. Or if you're to keep,
Okay, but I don't necessarily agree with that. But I mean, the concept, I mean, that concept that I just presented, though, that seems like a hierarchy of obligations. But what's wrong with that?
Right. So in order for a hierarchy to, okay, so facts as they exist don't exist in some sort of hierarchy. I don't think.
Why not?
Well, the way that I sort
Moral
of think of
obligations
facts is
made.
they're
The
sort of
thing
like
about-
level and plain, like they're all existing independent, or not really independent of each other, but all on sort of the same level. Like there is no evaluative difference between facts.
I don't know about that. I mean, to me, there
The-
can be multifaceted obligations, like the example I gave. Like I think we have an obligation to not lie unless there's a higher value, then we have an obligation. I mean, to me, that seems like a hierarchy.
Yeah. Totally.
Okay. So there would be
Totally.
some sort of like, so say there's the fact you ought not to lie. And then there's another fact, if you were to lie that causes somebody to be murdered, then it is no longer the case that you ought not to lie.
Right.
Is that sort of like a
That's the whole
secondary
problem
fact?
with.
Yeah.
That's the whole problem with the categorical imperative, is that it doesn't allow for hierarchies. But your framing is actually, it's just a more complicated version of the standard atheist. Like, if God were a good God, then he wouldn't allow X. If I were God, I wouldn't allow this to happen in my world. And what Caleb is arguing, and what I think is reasonable, is that God is not responsible for every action that takes place in the world, because he gave us free will. And the reason why infanticide occurs is either the corruption of the individual or the corruption of the society. It's not God is immoral for allowing that to happen. The people are immoral who carried out the act that is immoral, and they are held to the standard of accountability. It's not that God creates a perfect world where everybody, now God is responsible for everything that people do.
Right. So then
it's the same argument that like Tracy Harris makes. If I were God, I'd be a good. It's just way more complicated, but it's the same idea. If I were God, I'd be a good God, and I wouldn't allow a child to be raped. So.
Yeah, I think I guess difference, like I'm seeing how Caleb's solution sort of works. I think the way it wouldn't work if the moral facts are not describing like the actions of people, but rather the events that take place. So like if certain events have some sort of moral quality to them in that they ought not to occur, then it would be the case if God were to cause even secondarily them to occur.
What's interesting about that is that's the whole nub of the thing, because an atheist looking at a world in which a child gets raped says that ought not to occur. If I were God, I'd be a good God. And actually the moral component is the human action, which they have a choice in not doing, which they could easily not have done.
Right.
So yes, you're totally, what you're saying is correct, and it makes sense. It's just it's not, it's pretty much a standard atheist argument that God is responsible for the evil of the world.
It's funny. I'm drawing from this due to a script I had written about this main character that's an antinatalist, and he's like making an argument that because there are states of affair, or there are events or states of affairs that we know ought not to occur, then if we were to propagate the species such that these states of affairs would occur into the future, then we ought not to propagate the species, because that sort of like keeps these negative things from ever occurring.
Same sort of logic. Actually, Pine Creek makes a lot of arguments along these lines. Like, God should not have allowed you to be born knowing you'd wind up, damned for all time. God should not have allowed the world to exist. He makes a lot of these. And
I think that I think that's where the atheists have like their strongest arguments, is through the moral arguments against God's existence. I think especially if these types of facts are grounded within God's nature, which would seem to indicate that God would be unable to act in such a way that these moral facts are broken in some sense. But
there wouldn't be, because, okay, so I want to talk for a second about the principle of double effect. So I don't know if you're familiar with this, but okay, so double effect is the idea that you're morally, so if something is a side effect, and you have to be careful with the principle because it can sound wrong, but if something's a side effect of an action that's morally obligatory, even if it's a negative side effect, then the moral agent isn't culpable for that indirect side effect. So like, for example, and this is the principle that led to these trolley car examples and things where people are like, well, what about in this case, and so on. So like, for example, there are all these different scenarios. Imagine you're like on a airplane that's about to crash, and it's going to crash into one really busy area or an area with less people, but you have to crash it into one. You're going to crash it into the area with less people. Technically, somebody could say, well, that person killed those people. Well, indirectly they did, but that wasn't their intention. So it's an unavoidable side effect. So to me, God creating the world, and it has this negative side effect that, yeah, there's going to be people who do immoral things. If God has a morally justified, or you could even say obligatory reason for doing that, you can bring in the principle of double effect. And if you find that a plausible principle, and I think it's a pretty morally plausible principle, that would, to me, get around this worry. So like this idea that it feels like what you're presenting kind of has this monolithic sort of view that like, oh, morality is just like all or nothing, and there's no like multifaceted way in which it works. And it's like, obviously, like our choices are more complex.
Also, the key word that dry apologists used is obliged, because the thing that people forget is, like, let's take the example of the child rapist. Okay, in order for God to stop the child rapist, he would have to sovereignly override and will against what that person is a sovereign being, so they're allowed to do what they want, and God would have to use his power to override their sovereign will, which in and of itself would be an immoral action. And this is why I liked his some of dry apologist arguments, because he's who recognized that it's possible that God is obliged by his very nature. He cannot do something wrong, and to step in and stop a person from committing an immoral act would actually be, in certain contexts, wrong. The act of doing, because you're overriding a will. You're using your power to override somebody else's power. It's just power. I don't know if that was clear.
Well, I do want to add.
I don't even know if you heard me. I don't even know.
Yeah, we heard you.
Me.
Yeah, I heard you. So okay. The way that I would respond to the problem of moral evil is a little bit different than that, but that's similar to how I would argue. But I'm curious, Craig. I heard you say you agreed with some of my ideas. I want to know which ones you disagreed with.
I disagree with the ones that are wrong. I agree with the ones.
Which ones are those?
Right.
Well,
offhand, I don't remember.
Okay.
If you start talking, I'll probably remember it and go, I disagree. I don't remember offhand.
Well, this is where I'll just.
There were some things about it I liked.
So this is where I'll plug. So I just wrote this book summarizing a lot of my main points. So if anybody wants to check that out, it's on my Twitter page, but the link for it. But anyways, cool. That's where I lay out a lot of my main arguments that I discuss in more in depth than I've been able to sometimes in streams. But anyways, but yeah, I think God can have moral obligations that may shape a little bit differently than ours. And that leads to, or even if it's not an obligation, it's still a justified decision. I mean, there's debate over whether God has moral obligations. And I think a lot of theists would initially be uncomfortable with the idea that God has moral obligations. But I think that that's based on a misunderstanding of God's relation to morality.
I can see how at least one instance in which God would have moral obligations, say to himself. Like if he makes some sort of promise to some sort of people, then he would have an obligation of fulfilling that promise. I actually listened to that debate with on Unbelievable with Thomas J. Ord and somebody else, and that was one of the arguments. Yeah, that they were using. Now, I guess I'm still somewhat confused, I guess, by the more realist Platonist position. If God has some sort of obligations that are outside himself, that exist within sort of Platonic realm, I guess I can make sense of it if there's like some sort of evaluative difference, but if there's some sort of normative like prescription that's like being, I don't know, commanded of God, this seems to indicate, I guess, that this Platonic realm has a higher authority than God.
Right. That's the other common objection that misunderstands the nature of God, theologically speaking. God is incapable. When the Bible says nothing is impossible with God, that's not strictly true, because the same Bible says later on, it is impossible. He's the first person who ever introduced this concept that God is incapable of acting in ways inconsistent with himself. Not because he doesn't have freedom, because that's just not what God can do. Whether he will not, that's a debate that you can speculate on. But it's very clear in the theology that God is incapable of acting in a way inconsistent with himself. So like God not do other than in a given situation would be something different than self. He is. So he can't act differently. Not necessarily that he can't like prescriptive, like you're saying. It's subtle, but the difference is really important in terms of understanding it clearly. The one is theological interpretation of God being unable to act certain nature. His nature won't let him. And one is like there are these rules that God can't break, and these rules are more important than God. Do you see the difference? You heard me, right? Did everybody hear me? Nobody heard me?
I heard you. Yeah, I know. Well, some people, like John's suggesting, well, then God, there are these things that God obeys that are higher than him. And it's like, well, I don't, it's God's own moral nature, but let's just say they are higher than him. Like that wouldn't make it not true. They're not ontologically higher than him. And it's something like, I don't think these moral facts exist. They're not concrete things. So it's not like there's something controlling God. They're just truths that God recognizes, is the way I look at it. So, like
a logical truth.
Right. So I would say you can ground it in God's nature. I like to more talk about just being grounded in rationality. It's just a necessary feature of a rational agent's mind to recognize these types of things. And God is a rational agent or being, and he recognizes them. And, I don't see a problem with any of that.
So is it a property of the mind, or is it mind independent?
Well, it's mind independent, but it's not, it doesn't thereby, I don't think it thereby means it's existing in some realm out there like a Platonist would argue. But even if it did commit me to Platonism, then I would just accept Platonism. But I don't think that it necessarily needs to go that far. But when you say, is it a property of the mind, that might give the connotation that if the mind didn't exist, then those truths wouldn't be true. And I wouldn't say that. I would just say they just are necessary truths, full stop. They don't have to exist somewhere, though, to be necessary truths. It's like, imagine if nothing exists, well, this might beg the question, but including this realm of Platonic truths or whatever, like it would just still be necessarily true that 1 + 1 = 2. It's just a truth. It's not grounded in any object or anything. It's just true. And I don't think that I need to thereby then postulate there's some Platonic. See, the problem I think with Platonism is that it's saying like, well, in order to have this truth, you got to have this thing out there. And like, that's the truth. And to me, it seems like, and this is why it's implausible, it makes it seem like this truth is then grounded in this quasi-concrete thing. And like, that's just not correct. And that's the problem with grounding it, saying it has to be caused by God. because it's just like these things are just necessarily true, full stop. They just are. They don't exist as objects. They're just true, and our minds can recognize that. I mean, I still like, it's kind of mysterious in a way, but it's like it's less mysterious than any other, or at least it's the most plausible option that we have.
Yeah, I think the problem, I guess, is like to say that something exists without any sort of ontology almost seems like a contradiction in some sense, because like if an ontology is like what it means for it to exist, that yeah, and I would also sort of push back and say that like if these necessary truths are dependent upon a mind that exists in all possible worlds, then they too would be necessary in that they exist in all possible worlds.
Yeah, but remember that distinction I made about feasible worlds and logically possible worlds? So like truths exist in every logically possible world, but I don't think that any concrete thing exists in every logically possible world. Just in every feasible world is there a necessary being.
Yeah, I'm not sure I see the or I understand the difference between those, because like as far as I understand, the ontological argument sort of rests upon the if a necessary being exists in all possible worlds, then they exist within our concrete world as well, because that's one of the possible worlds.
Yeah, but the ontological argument, well, first off, I don't think it works. But second of all, you can just change necessary in the ontological argument to mean feasibly necessary, and the argument would be fine. The idea that God is logically necessary, I don't have a problem with saying that, but it seems like that's incorrect, because we can conceive of a world that God doesn't exist, and there wouldn't be a contradiction in that. So it's not to say that thereby God's not necessary. It's just to understand there are different senses of what necessary means. So God is metaphysically necessary, meaning he has to exist in every world in which there can be. But logically necessary is just that just means conceivable.
Mm-hmm.
Or excuse me, it means something that doesn't have a contradiction involved in it, but it may not actually be possible. So it's just a subtle way of reframing it to make necessary distinctions.
Yeah. Gosh, what was the thing I just mentioned before that I wanted to go back to? Shoot. Oh, well, do you want to move on to the our argument that I had against determinism? Since it's somewhat related, I guess, to this. As I sort of see it, there are sort of these three, I guess, three prongs or implications to if determinism is true. And by determinism, I'm meaning that like the preceding states of affairs necessitate a particular state of affairs following it in such a way that it could not be any other. So different from, say, like a probabilistic universe in which, like, say you shine a photon at a 50% reflective mirror, and the photon will either go left or right. And that at least seems to be like some sort of true probability, depending upon your theory of quantum, your quantum theory. But that's at least some instance of like what we suspect probability or indeterminism to take place. Anyway, if determinism is true, there's one of these three entailments to that. One, the maxim that ought implies can is not true, because there are things which we ought not to do that where there are things that we ought not to do, and the preceding components of the universe necessitate our acting different from that thing in which we ought not to do, and thereby we ought to do something that we're unable to do. Two, there are no such things as moral true or true moral obligations or prescriptions in any sense. That would be true like for subjectivism, for moral relativism, moral constructivism as well. Like none of those would be true. Like it would have to be either moral error theory or moral non-cognitivism, I think. And then the third entailment would be that can implies ought. So this is sort of the reverse of the ought implies can, but anything in which a person can do and does do, because that's the only thing that can do is whatever it is that they do, means that is something that they ought to do. Just that's a way in which you can keep the moral claim, or that's a way in which you can keep moral obligations for things. But of course, not many people will be willing to go with that. I think only like some determinists, such as like somebody like Nietzsche, who sort of like gets rid of all morality. But I think there's ways in which, like, I guess the will to power, like if you were to say that whatever a will has the possible, whatever a will desires that it is capable of performing, that is what it ought to do, which would entail everything that a will does, then that would be an instance of like can implying ought. Anyway, those are the three sort of entailments, I think, to determinism. And you sort of brought up how the first entailment was probably the most likely that some determinists will go with. And that seems to be the case. I've brought this forward to like several different determinists as well. And for me, at least, it seems quite almost contradictory to say that I have a moral obligation to perform an action in which I am physically incapable of actually performing that action. Like, what does it even mean to say that I have an obligation there? Like, what, like, difference, for one thing, would it be if like it's telling me I should do this thing, but I can't do this thing? Like, it seems to me in that instance, like the thing that's telling me I should do this thing is actually wrong in some sense. Like for some reason, it doesn't even realize that I'm not able to do that thing. And I think at least the way in which we normally use prescriptive claims, we're doing it in regards to things that people can do. Like, hey, can you take out the trash for me? And if it's the case that, oh, they're a paralytic, then like that seems like a very strange thing to request of a person to do. But I don't know, that's sort of like my long-winded argument there.
Well, let me ask, I mean, are you a determinist?
No.
Okay. So you're just putting forth this argument against determinism.
Right. I think like if somebody is a determinist and then they see that these entailments all would be true under determinism, but yet they still can't bear, or if they don't see these entailments actually being true, then that would mean that they would have to sort of give up their determinism. And I think there's like arguments for free will independent of theism. So it's not like I want to hold that off so that if you're wanting to retain some sort of moral realism in that what you ought implies can, then that you have to be some sort of theist. Like I think Kant has a fairly good argument for free will in some sense that you could hold to, and Kant doesn't hold to any sort of theistic ontology exactly.
Well, that, I mean, Kant is viewed as a theist, and his view of like morality and moral obligation was an argument he gave for God.
Well, I know he gives a practical argument for God's existence.
Yeah,
like
but
if
similar to kind of what you're suggesting.
I mean,
my understanding.
I guess so. Like, yeah, Kant definitely agrees with ought implies can. Like, that's how he kind of came to his sort of moral theories, through that sort of maxim, and then like ruling out everything in which a person can't do, and then actually like what are the necessary preconditions to rationality, and then from there you can sort of derive these sorts of moral claims as well. And I don't think the categorical imperative like works exactly. Like, for one thing, I don't think self-referentially it works, because like I would not will that a person other than myself were to only accept moral prescriptions that they would only will upon other people. So just as an example, like say somebody is an alcoholic and they decide to completely go off of alcohol. If in order for them to sort of hold to that position, if one of us, either myself or that other person, were were a Kantian, they would only be able to do that if they also willed that everybody else in the entire planet also went off of alcohol. But I see no reason to think that a person could abstain from alcohol for their own inabilities to sort of deal with it, while also holding that other people are welcome to drink alcohol because they don't have that same sort of like addictive drive within them. But anyway, that's sort of my argument. And so, yeah, I think the way, I don't know, at least for myself, I'm having a hard time understanding what it would even mean to say that I have a moral obligation to perform an action that I'm physically incapable of performing. Or you could flip it the other way. Like I have a moral obligation to abstain from an action that I'm physically incapable of abstaining from.
Well, I think a lot of determinists are probably going to be, or at least a number of them are actually going to probably take the idea that there just aren't moral obligations, because they're going to, a lot of them are atheists that are going to probably be non-moral realists. But let's just take, like, I mean, I accept moral realism, of course, and I accept free will. But and as I'd suggested to you before, I still think it's coherent, the idea that there could be moral obligations. Like you said, well, it's almost like these things obligate things and they don't know what they're obligating. But see, that's the difficulty. These obligations aren't thinking at all. They're just facts. Like,
I'm not saying that they're thinking. It's just like, what does it even mean? Like to say that a moral obligation has been fulfilled or has been broken, it seems like it's referring to something. Like if, say, I have a moral obligation to be benevolent and there's an instance in which I'm not being benevolent, like what's the example? I think within Stoicism, if like you have a torch that's lit and somebody else has a torch that's not lit, you have some sort of obligation to light their torch because it costs you nothing and it provides them with the ability to see. Now, like that seems to me an instance in which I'm fulfilling that moral obligation. And then if it was the case that I didn't do that thing, that would be an instance in which I'm failing to fulfill that obligation. And so I think, like, in order to actually connect up these moral oughts to the world in which we live within, like it has to have some sort of like truth maker, I guess, or it's not even like the truth maker, but it's like what I guess the indication that this moral obligation has been fulfilled or not fulfilled. But
I just don't see anything incoherent though about, that they're, to me, it's kind of like, to use an analogy, it's kind of like a teacher says, like, any good student should be able to get an A+ in this class, but maybe none of the students in the class can actually achieve that. And the teacher could say, well, none of you are good enough students, but it would still be a factual claim. So like, what if that none of us are actually none of us are virtuous enough to live up to the moral law? And you could say, well, then why is it held over our heads? And you could say, well, because we should be more virtuous beings than we are. We can't be in our state, but we still should. Like,
yeah, that seems like so strange to me, to say that we should be more virtuous human beings, but we can't be. Like, why is it the case that I should be a more virtuous being than I can be?
Well, let's go back to your example from earlier, because you were saying that maybe like lions are immoral for eating zebras, but lions can't help it. Like, that's the way that they've evolved. So it's like,
that's why I don't think lions have any sort of obligation to refrain from eating zebras.
Right. So it seems okay. So it seems like, yeah, but okay. So going back to earlier, but it seems like you reject moral obligations also, or you have a problem with the idea that there are moral obligations too, right?
I think that moral obligation, like I'm tentatively holding to a form of moral constructivism. So like being faced with the Euthyphro dilemma, I'm not going to take the classical theist route and say that moral obligations are derived from God's nature. I'm just going to say they're arbitrary, and that like God being the programmer to the simulation gets to choose what rules are for that simulation. And if it's the case that certain people ought to behave in certain manners and other people ought to behave in other manners, there's no contradiction there, because they're specifically placed upon, or the only specific people have specific obligations that don't necessarily have to be the same as other people, in the same way that like maybe animals have some mild forms of obligations, maybe for like caring for their own young, or something like that. I don't know if you really need to include animals in the whole moral sphere, but yeah.
Actually, I think your position is closer to what some people would classify as a classical theist position, and that a more like, I don't know if you're familiar, like when you say classical theist, some people just mean like a traditional monotheist, but
Right.
classical,
I was meaning like the classical response to the Euthyphro dilemma.
right, but I think that response is more recent in some ways. So when you say classical theist, I think more like Thomistic natural law, and actually your response is more in line with that perspective, at least within some strands. So anyways,
yeah, that probably makes sense, because like within Thomism, if a creature is created in such a way that its nature necessitates like it behaving immorally, like I think Thomas Aquinas actually held to death occurring before the fall, because he recognized that certain animals were carnivorous, and so in order for them to have exist at that point in time, they had to survive off of living off of other animals. And so that's like, and so for animals which are carnivorous, there is no, because they're fulfilling their teleological end, in that way, they're not behaving immorally. But
right.
yeah. And I also reject the notion of rights, I think, other than as sort of like man-made social constructions. Like I don't even know if God imparts any sort of rights onto humans either, because it seems like if say a person had a right to autonomy or something like that, but they existed within the wilderness in which let's say a bear attacked them and ate them, would that mean that the bear then infringed upon the person's right? And to me, that seems sort of ridiculous. And which is why I would say that rights are only in regards to other human beings and how they ought to behave with fellow human beings. But I don't know if you accept the notion of natural rights at all, though.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense if you're going to accept moral values, then, natural rights to me seem like a plausible corollary. It's just like, yeah, if it's wrong to harm somebody, then they have a right to not be harmed. I think they go hand in hand.
Right, but wouldn't the instance in which a person being harmed, wouldn't the immoral, like it, to me, I see a right as fitting a responsibility to the from the other person's perspective that they're failing to fulfill. So like my right to not be murdered, let's say, is the responsibility of all the people in which I interact with to not murder me. But if there's an instance in which somebody does murder me, that's them failing to live up to their responsibility. But if I was like to be killed by some sort of lion that's out in the wild, I wouldn't say that lion had any sort of responsibility not to murder me.
Right. Because it's not an agent. I still think that the lion did violate your rights, but we just wouldn't say that about the lion because we know it's not a moral agent. If you have a right to life, then that's taken away from you. Your rights were violated. We just don't use the phrasing that way when we're talking about natural things, I think. I mean, that's the way I look at it, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. If we don't phrase it that way, is it because it doesn't seem to fit well with that, or is it just that?
Well, people phrase things wrong. Like we use our phrasing, if a natural disaster occurs, we call it or at least insurance companies call it an act of God. But I have problems with that phrasing. I mean, there's all kinds of problematic, imprecise phrasings that get used.
Mm-hmm.
So,
gotcha. Yeah. I don't know. Did you have anything to add, Craig?
No, you guys are roboting a little. Is JB coming? He's not going to show up.
I think he's like I invited him, but I think he has to cook food for his family. We got a lot of comments though in the chat. We can sort of go through them.
Yeah, read some of the stuff.
I don't know if you had anything you wanted to sort of bring up as well, Caleb.
No, I mean, I didn't have anything else to add so far. I mean, I just don't see a problem with, having moral obligations and moral facts and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I know in my response to you, I laid out sort of the argument for prescriptivism, like if moral prescriptions are true. And the argument I used, like I think I already laid it out earlier in the conversation, but just for all the newcomers, like if there are rational prescriptions that exist, then there must be some sort of rational prescriber. There are rational prescriptions that exist, and for these rational prescriptions, we humans are not the prescriber. Therefore, there must be some sort of rational non-human prescriber, and that being in which is who we call God, something like that. I know for the moral realist, they would say that premise 1 is false. For the moral constructivist, they would say that premise 3 is false. And then for the moral error theorist, they would say that premise 2 is false. I guess you're taking the first premise. You're taking the moral realist approach and saying that one's false, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking for your argument because I know you posted it so I can see it. But yeah, I think that moral prescriptions exist, but I don't think that means they need a prescriber.
Yeah, and I would agree. It's sort of, I guess, intuitive in a sense, or maybe it's not intuitive to all people. But I would say that at least every instance in which we observe any sort of prescriptive claim being made is being made from some sort of prescriptive. It is made from some sort of rational prescriber. Like, I don't know, unless.
Yeah, that's true for us. Like if there's like with positive law, there's a law, somebody needs to institute that because those are contingent laws. But I would say that they are working within, like a natural law, talk about the eternal law, and that eternal law just is. So I feel like your argument does sound intuitively plausible because our minds think about contingent laws, and that would be true. But I don't think we can then go to necessary laws and apply the same kind of logic.
Mm-hmm. So the way in which, like, it seems to me at least that prescriptions are like direct byproducts of prescribers, in sort of the same way that sounds are the direct byproducts of things which are capable of hearing. So like ears, like if there is something being heard, there must be a ear in which to hear it. There is something being heard. It's not your ears that are hearing it. Therefore, it's something else's ears that are hearing it. That would be, I guess, sort of the analogous way I would use that argument for something as obvious as that. I don't know if it works exactly, but it's something sort of like that.
Well, yeah, but to me, like that analogy kind of has the causality going the opposite direction, it seems, right? Because like the ears are receiving the sound, but in your prescription, it's like somebody giving out these laws. But I think
sure. So okay, so you could do it the other way around then. Like if there's a shout that's if there is a shout that occurs, then there must be something shouting. There is a shout that occurred. I wasn't the one that shouted. You weren't the one that shouted. Therefore, there must be some other thing that made the shout. And that would be sort of the way I would see the, but yeah, it's just, I can't. Okay.
Yeah,
I guess
shout is an actual action that somebody does carry out. I mean, it's like it's a contingent event that takes, something that takes place. And like, yeah, laws that are like that, yeah, they do need to derive from somebody, contingent laws that are put in place. But I don't think, necessary moral truths are like that. And maybe we shouldn't call them laws then. We should call them something else, just like facts. Like if I just say they're necessary facts, that doesn't thereby go, oh, well, who is the necessary fact dealer? It would just be like, there isn't
right.
one. There's just
well,
necessary facts.
And I guess the way in which I would argue that they're more like actions would be sort of referencing back to our earlier bit about how certain facts will have a hierarchy to them, and that like the obligation not to lie will be superseded by the obligation to keep a murder from occurring. And so if, excuse me, it was both the fact that I ought not to lie and I ought not to allow a murder to occur, then both of these facts would be coming in conflict with each other. And it would be the case that I both ought to keep the murder from occurring and I ought not to lie, which would entail like some sort of contradiction for what I ought to do there. I don't know, there's probably a better example that would make more sense there than lying and keeping a murder from occurring. But
that's actually the classic example, because it's wrong to lie unless the Jews are in the basement and the Nazi knocks on the door. Then it's right to lie. Do you have Jews in the house? Actually, no, I don't. Actually, no, I don't. There's the house as you didn't fry. So you lie directly to his face, and in that particular instance, it's the right thing to do. And I guess this is one way of thinking about it is on a hierarchy of rights, it is far more correct action. Your oughts are hierarchical. You ought to save lives before you ought not to lie.
So I would argue, I guess, sort of similar to the parable, I think, listed by or given by Jesus, is that like if there's a some sort of lord or ruler that some person underneath him owes him like a great deal of money, and then makes his kind of
the debt case. You talk about the debt.
Yeah. He makes his case to the ruler and says like, I can't pay it. Things have been going bad for me. The ruler has the ability to disregard the obligation that person had towards him. Like that, it's like if moral realism was true, I would say that obligation would still be there. Like even if the person that even if the ruler,
but you're also getting at the root of part of the point of the cross, is that we in our carnal nature this is the actual theology of Christianity, that we in our carnal nature are unable to fulfill the requirements of the law. Therefore, we required a sacrifice and a stand-in, someone who was able to fulfill the requirements and stood in our place. The one thing I want to ask Caleb, because he mentioned when you were on last week, you kind of destroyed the tag argument, but it's very similar ground. The reason why you don't like the moral argument is that you're kind of making the same case, that moral facts are just facts and they don't require the moral fact giver or the moral fact dealer. They just are. They're just what makes things rationally. It's very similar to the argument you made about logical truths, that they don't require. Did I robot? Am I gone?
No, I hear you.
It's similar with the argument.
Yeah, it's the same objection. Yeah, because I see, moral truths are necessary truths like logical truths are. So, you don't need a further explanation of them. Now,
and moral truths would be necessary truths for like the functioning of a society. That's where some atheists are coming around to the idea that there are such things as moral facts.
Well,
and go ahead.
Well, for the functioning of a society, though, it, of course, is a separate topic, right? Because I mean, something could be useful and not true, or not useful and still true, right?
Yeah. Okay. But so you were going to say,
Well, I was just going to add that I still think that a moral argument, or this tag argument. So while I don't think they deductively follow in proving God, I just wanted to add that that doesn't mean that they're fruitless arguments, because they do open up. They can open somebody up to believing in something beyond just the material, empirical realm. So in
yeah,
that
well,
sense, they can still be
that's
helpful, but they don't deductively prove God.
that's exactly what I said. Like the Tyler Vila tag argument is actually a really good argument for kind of strongly indicating that there probably is a God, but it's not a proof of God. It's
Well,
like
I
if
don't
you
know that it does that, but it opens somebody up to being beyond just being an empiricist. This is the way I would look at it. But yeah, you can still argue that.
Yeah.
You can argue that it's good evidence for God. I'm not convinced that it's. I don't know. But anyway, it can help open somebody up to theism, to be its strength.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So actually, from kind of what you were saying there, Craig, I think I could probably refine my argument to make rather a theological case that if there are, let's say the wages of sin is death. Let's say that is the natural justice. In order for justice
You
to
listening,
occur,
atheists? Go ahead.
the natural order for justice is any instance in which a sin occurs, that moral agent ought not to continue to exist in order to sin. Or
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. For
Yeah.
every moral action, there will be moral consequence.
Then it would be the case that for Christ, in order to offer up grace to sinners such that they could have eternal life, would be going against the moral obligations of the universe there, I think.
That's a one total theological framing that people talk about all the time. That yes, it's God's justice satisfied by Christ's sacrifice on the cross. That now God need not pour out his wrath on you, John, for all the evil things that you have done, because your debt has been paid. That's a whole theological framing. Some people object to aspects of it. Some Christians.
I would object to that understanding of the atonement, just so you're aware.
Well, if the debt being paid, let's see, it would seem that only the moral arbiter could be the one that changes whether a debt is paid or not. And so that, I guess, would be an argument for why moral obligations are, I guess, arbitrary, or yeah, I guess arbitrary would be sort of the correct usage there, because it's actually arbitrated by God, the moral arbiter, the moral arbiter of these sort of obligations.
Yeah, and that's even like, you sin against God, you sin against the world that he wanted to create. You are destroying it, to one degree or another. You are, yeah. What was your objection? I know that's what I just said was kind of like, it wasn't meant to be a atonement theory or whatever it's called, but kind of was. I was just talking in the moment. I wasn't saying like this is case closed. I was just pointing out that John is heading towards Christianity when he starts thinking that way.
But so John, I mean, I assumed that you were a Christian until I hear the things that Craig says about you. But
what's he saying while I'm gone?
No, the stuff he says in your presence.
Yeah. I was raised in a Hebrew roots movement, which is sort of an ex-evangelical return towards the Mosaic law while still holding to Christ as the Messiah, and also like holding to all the pre-Christian sort of feast days and all that. And then I don't know, right now I'm I guess still exploring, but actually inquiring into Eastern Orthodoxy myself.
He leans Christian. He's very similar to Nathan. They're both almost like similar. They're two sides of the same coin, except Nathan leads agnostic and he leans Christian.
Yeah.
But other than that, they're just these like thoughtful young rapscallions.
Right. I would say that Nietzsche has sort of like buried himself into my head, which has sort of like led to kind of question a lot of
Right, because
these
you want to be
natural
cool.
moral and yeah,
You're like,
exactly.
how can I be cool and be Christian at the same time? How can I be like a
Well,
nihilistic badass and
I'll,
like have
I'll,
no morals and like
I'll also
will to
say,
power and take over countries and stuff as a Christian?
yeah,
Can't.
Nietzsche makes a strong case for that the will to morality is anti-life in general. Like the like what is it? He has an example of like the rabbit telling the hawk that it ought not to fly because it impinges upon the rabbit's ability to do what it likes. But it's
Right.
part of
I
the
wouldn't say
hawk's
it's
nature in order
I
to
wouldn't say it's a strong case, but it's definitely an appealing case.
and
You're right at the age where like that's
yeah.
when I was really into Nietzsche too, where it was like, I wanted to be a punk rock Nietzsche guy.
And
like,
I would say that like if God is beyond good and evil, then the argument from evil like completely fails against God's existence.
Right. But that's a whole other ball of wax
Yeah.
with like.
Wait, but I'm just curious, why do you lean towards a specific denomination or church, but you don't convert to that? Like I'm wondering where your reasoning is.
I think I still have certain familial obligations towards my family who are all still Hebrew within the Hebrew roots movements, and so I would have to develop a strong enough case for a strong enough case against the Hebrew roots movement and for orthodoxy, which is just something that's going to take up time. And also, like I'm not fully sure. There's plenty of reasons for why the Protestants have sort of like tried to step outside of the religious substructure of both the Catholic Church and the even further back, I guess the Eastern Orthodox Church, even though there's not that much connection between Protestantism and that. But anyway, that's and so right now I'm still very much in trying to develop my own understanding of ontology, and especially in relation to Scripture.
I mean, I think you can hold the sort of moral ontology you've been suggesting, this kind of divine constructivism. I think it's compatible with Christianity. I just wouldn't be, to me, it's more a philosophical dispute. I wouldn't agree with it, but I don't see, like, to me, it's similar to like how some natural law theorists argue.
Right. So how would you respond, I guess, to the differences then between, say, the commands issued by God during the time of Moses and the commands issued by Jesus during the time of Christianity?
Like what, like the moral difference?
Well, the fact that there like certain restrictions, say from eating pork, that were in place for the Jewish people are no longer in place for the Jewish people within Christianity.
Well, I mean, some of the, I guess like a popular response is that those laws were put in place to kind of help with an identity focus and so on leading up to the time of Christ. They weren't like eternal. Now, that may not be what, the Old Testament says, but that's, a popular response. But I mean, if we're going to broaden that to like other things like slavery and, the warfare, I mean, I just don't think God commanded those things. So I have a looser view of the Bible.
Right. So the way I sort of see it is that like God has the ability to enter into covenants with people. And so like in the same way that you and I can enter into some sort of contract where we both have made some sort of promise to one another, that if you uphold your promises, then I will respond to you in a certain way. And if I uphold my promises, then you'll interact with me in a certain way. And I just say that like God can enter into covenants with Abraham, Moses, through Jesus, other covenants, just depending upon the people themselves. But anyway, yeah, that's at least how I'm sort of squaring morality with the Bible and also, my, I guess, philosophy.
Well, let me ask,
right now.
Do you think that you lean towards this sort of prescriptivist view because sometimes I kind of think that a lot of Christians will think like the divine command theory must be true because in the Old Testament, God gives the 10 Commandments and so on, and they might have this idea like, well, that was God giving out the moral law. Like, do you think like that's kind of influences your thoughts here?
Yeah, I'd say so, and I think that the sort of argument I was laying out before with like if and I don't know, it may be that the free will defense works completely against it, but it also seems to me that if the references are to events, like there are certain events which ought not to take place, then I don't think the
Well, what do
free
you
will
mean
defense
by
works there.
events?
So if the event of, say, a child dying of starvation, that's an event that could occur without any sort of moral agent performing that. If it's the case that that state of affairs ought not to occur, then any creator of a world in which that state of affairs does occur would be a violation of that moral fact, I guess. And so if the moral facts are either subordinate, or God is subordinate to these moral facts, or if these facts are not representations, reflections of God's nature, then I don't think that, like, I don't know, what's the Plato's argument for the demiurge? Like the good cannot be the creator of this world because this world has instances of the instances of harms occurring which are not for the benefit of the people being harmed.
Well, then that's where I would bring in, the theodicy. I like to argue. I think it can deal with those natural evils more plausibly. Because I think there is a problem. God create. And I don't know if this is quite what you're getting at, but like, why would God create a world in which there are suffering that occurs that's not the result of somebody's free will? That is a problem. But that's where I would bring in, the type of theodicy I argued to.
Yeah. So I don't know. It seems like if there is some higher moral obligation, like you ought not to create a world in which everyone can experience total happiness at all moments in time. Not that I think that's an actual moral fact, but if there were some sort of moral fact like that, then God would have a moral obligation not to create any sort of world at all.
Well, listen to his argument on Scholar Fiction's channel, because he talked about that.
Or buy my book.
Yeah.
Or send me money for 2 copies of his book, and I'll buy one and read it and share it with you.
Okay, Craig.
But the thing is, he kind of answers this, and it's actually a plausible. It's a pretty decent answer. That like in heaven there are no natural evils because the moral laws are all perfect and perfectly in line with God's will. And if John, you are in heaven, you are going to perfectly line up with God's will. So God's kingdom is in heaven, and we're supposed to pray, "Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven." So God's kingdom means the natural laws have been perfected. And his idea actually lines up with the Bible, because there's passages in like Romans 8 that talks about, how we groan for the days when the sons of God will be revealed and the earth will basically become what it's supposed to be. So that it's not just you and I that are fallen, it's the entire world process is fallen. But God can't birth you directly into heaven, John, because that he needs to give you a chance. I'm not saying he's right. I'm just saying it's a really decently thought out argument.
Right. So
you need to get it. Wait, before you go, you need to get a chance to want to be in this perfect world here on earth. Do you see what I'm saying? Because if you're a bad person, you might not want to be there because you can't cuss there, John, and you can't smoke crack there, John. So you might not want to go. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, I'm not saying it all that great, but that's
no. Yeah. There's a soul building theodicy that I've made before, not in relation to God, but rather in relation to the simulation hypothesis, and that at least it's a possibility that there could be simulation creators just for the fact that they wouldn't want to allow evil people to be in a inside, wouldn't want evil people to live within live within a world in which they have full capacity to like create technological catastrophes through, I don't know, whatever inventions that they have in the future, which I know is unrelated. Sorry, but yeah.
Well, in the perfect world of heaven, okay, where the natural laws all function perfectly, and who knows, maybe lions don't eat zebras there. Maybe you could talk to the lions, John, and talk about
the lamb lays down with the lion. Yeah,
exactly, as the good book says. But there's no sin there. So in order for you to have morally regenerated yourself to the point where you would get there, you're choosing it. You want to live like that. You want to live in line like that. And, you know, a third of the angels rebelled, even in a perfect world. So obviously there's some people, not anybody who's listening here or anybody in this room, who don't want that. You see what I'm saying?
Right. So I think, Caleb, your response then to sort of like what I was saying, if it's the case that a child ought not to starve to death is a moral fact, that moral fact could be subordinated to some other higher moral fact of like, God ought to create a world in which human beings could come into relationship with him over time.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
And I'm saying it's the only way. And I'm saying God is bound in that sense that if he wants to create a reality in which people can participate in relation with him and with others, that's the only way to do it. So, you know, it allows, there's going to be temporary suffering, but I think that God's morally justified in bringing this about to achieve this higher purpose.
Right. And if he's right, think of how, and the Bible even says this, I do not think the sufferings of the present time are worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed in us. So, you know, the temporary sufferings are irrelevant if most of the people who suffer temporarily, you know, go to live in heaven forever and ever and ever, where there's no sorrow and no suffering at all.
Right. So could you give an example, Caleb, of like an instance in which moral fact or no regular facts are superordinated by other facts in some sense?
Well, what about the lying example?
No, not moral facts, just regular facts, like just as some sort of analogy.
Well, I'm sure we could come up with a bunch, like
does 2 plus 2 equal 4 only under circumstances, or is there some sort of other?
Well, no, not like a mathematical fact, maybe, but like you could take see, if you're asking for a necessary truth, maybe not. But like, for example, objects attract unless, you know, gravity doesn't hold or something. You know, there can be conditional facts, but let's say we're talking about necessary truths. No, but I mean, well, some people would, of course, say the laws of logic don't always apply, but like I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, you know. But no, I would say probably math and logic is always applicable, but morality is flexible in that way because then so I think then we need to unpack what is it, you know, what moral system makes the most sense. So like, for example, why is it the case that it seems that lying is wrong most of the time, but not all the time? It's not because the act of lying, to me, like it's not speaking falsehoods that's wrong. So some people might argue, well, speaking falsehoods is immoral. No, I don't think that's what's immoral. We speak falsehoods all the time. What's wrong is the fact that you're misleading another person. So to me,
the intention of deception.
Oh, yeah,
not even
that's a good point.
Of deception, because it could be wrong. I mean, it could be right to deceive a child to protect them from something. What's wrong is when you violate somebody else's human dignity or something like that, and that is always wrong. So you see, it's the violation of dignity that's always wrong, but how that gets manifested is going to take different forms given the circumstances.
Also, so there's qualifications for lying too, just like it's a felony to lie under oath. And there's a reason why it's a felony, because if people could easily lie under oath, then you could totally corrupt the entire nature of justice, what actually occurred then. Whereas if you lie to a child, you know, a lot of times you're doing it in a way to benefit them. Most of the time, you would be doing it in a way to benefit. So the motivation of the heart is a huge factor in what is ultimately right or wrong, and why you do an action too. Because you can lie a lot of different times where you're actually doing it to help somebody, to not hurt somebody. You're not doing it to violate the truth, so to speak. Whereas other times you'd be lying and it's a pure corruption. It's like almost pure evil in that circumstance.
Right. So the way I kind of see what you're saying there, Caleb, is that like the moral fact of like don't lie is derivative from the higher moral fact of don't violate a person's human dignity. And the instance of lying to the instance of telling the truth to the Nazi officer would be a higher violation of human dignity than I think I reversed the telling the truth would be a higher instance of the violation of human dignity, because it would be violating all the dignities of the Jews that you're hiding in the basement, so it would be like a lesser evil in some sense.
Well, here's the thing. You can make that argument, but here's the thing. I'm not even sure I would have to concede that point, because what I would say is if the lie is justified, it's not a violation of dignity, right? Because like say you're lying to a child to protect them. You're not violating the child's dignity. You're protecting that child. That's upholding their dignity. Now, if you're lying to the Gestapo, you're not violating the Gestapo's dignity. You're stopping them from violating somebody else's dignity. And in a way, you're upholding their dignity because you're preventing them from carrying out some evil. So I would say, this idea like the lesser of evils, that may be a mistaken idea. So it's what action actually respects people's dignity. And to me, that's what makes something a moral action or not. It's about somebody's dignity. So God creating a world in which there's natural evils and such, that's an indirect result of, at least I'm arguing, of the only way God can enter into a relation with people. So he's upholding our dignity, even though there are bad side effects. So and we can think of moral examples. It's kind of like the example I talked about earlier about the person in the airplane. Say they could only crash it into a crowded area or into a less crowded area. The fact that they crash it into a less crowded area, they're not violating the dignity of the people they crashed into, because that's I mean, that one's a little bit trickier, but because it's an indirect result is my point.
And like I certainly agree with like where there's like of the two available options, going with the one that violates the less human dignity, or
to violate whether one of them violates the dignity and one of them doesn't, is what I'm saying.
John, it's getting late.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah, we'll wrap up. But what you're saying there definitely fit with, like, I know Socrates makes the same sort of case in Plato's Republic. Something like, if you know that your friend is going to or is like addicted to alcohol, or is going to do something incredibly stupid, like cheat on his friend's wife or something like that, it is you're helping him in a sense by either lying to him, by saying, oh no, she's not attracted to you at all, or by like restraining him in some sense. I think that there's a similar argument to that is laid out there by Plato. But
see if there are any questions.
Right. Okay. I know we actually had a pretty active chat. I'm going to have to read through all of it later just to kind of see what everybody was saying. I know we got pleasure of doubt. Leaving a lot of stuff in here. Let me see if there's any particular questions though.
What was pleasure of doubt saying? That guy from the John Vervaeke chats?
Yeah. That's Brett.
Yeah, I know.
Let's see. If this coronavirus gets too much worse, is eating my child back on the table? I think that's a joke there. You reboot your computer right before stream. It might help your connection. Oh, that's the thing. Craig's not even using a computer. He's on his iPad.
iPhone.
Yeah. All right, here's from Spartan Theology. Math operates with facts, so isn't the order of operations basically an example of a hierarchy of facts? I guess, like, if sort of, I don't know, at least taking a nominalist approach to mathematics, where, like, I don't know how it exactly goes, but if 1 + 1 = 2, then 1,000 + 1 = 1,001. If that's sort of like derivative from the primary fact of 1 + 1 = 2, then I could see how it's sort of like a hierarchy of facts there. I don't know. Let's see. It may not necessitate it. I don't know what he's referring to right here. Okay. Well, that's one possibility, but I can't argue. I don't think God escapes responsibility for the fall if that's the case. Oh, okay. Sorry. I'll read back his other things. The problem of evil is not an argument against the existence of God. They may say something about the character of God, though, as in he is not omnibenevolent.
Right.
And I think he also says that, like, since God creates people with the desire to rape children, that is that's an example of God not having a fully benevolent character to him.
Who said that?
That was Brett.
Okay. Yeah, that's a standard. That's what I think is the more important objection. There's two legs to the problem of evil. Is the philosophical, the logical problem of evil, like, and then the far more important one is usually emotional. And that's where trust and faith come into play, and the character of God, because that's what's really at issue, is what type of a God would allow this to occur. That's a good point. I mean, there's 1,000 words that you could say in response to it, but go ahead, try guy. What do you say?
Oh, well, I mean, obviously, I'm gonna say that evil desires are a type of natural evil, and we live in a world where things don't operate in accordance with God's will fully. So there's going to be, people are still culpable though and acting upon their desires, but we have, like Christianity talks about concupiscence, and that can get disordered. And I would say it's a natural evil. So somebody who, builds bad habits and they have natural disorders, that's going to result in, problematic, like what he's getting at. But I would need to, of course, unpack this some more, and
right.
I'd be willing to talk to Pleasure of Doubt about that.
He's great. Yeah, it seems like there's sort of this unstated premise that if you give somebody the option to perform an evil act, then that makes you immoral. But like, say,
well, that's the gist of the argument, is that God is somehow morally culpable for the evil of the world to some degree. And
right,
it's also questioning the character of God. Like, there was a Holocaust. When you actually read some of the details of the Holocaust, and like every hair on your arm stands up, the first most natural question is, how could God have allowed this? That's right. A normal question. That's a normal human, angst-ridden, but normal question, normal philosophical question. How could God be allowing this and still be good? And I don't want to get into it on right now, but there's 1,000 different ways to answer that.
Yeah, and I guess sort of the unstated position is that, like, it would be better to put somebody into a position in which they were unable to perform an evil action than to put them into a position in which they could perform that evil action and then they do so. I guess the one sort of response I might, just thinking off the top of my head, would be something like, only by giving them the option to perform an evil action can they overcome their own ability, or no, they can overcome their own natural inclination towards that option. Similar, I guess, in a sort of analogous way, that if you have agoraphobia, putting yourself into more incrementally more populated areas to sort of overcome that, in a sort of sense. Like, if we have a natural inclination towards evil, then putting us into circumstances in which we could perform evil but manage to control ourselves through certain means to refrain from doing so. Then we can put ourselves into more extravagant scenarios so that we won't do evil. I don't know if that's similar to your theodicy, though, Caleb.
His is a little, one of the things that his makes clear that I like about it is that giving you the option to do an evil act, God is morally obligated to do so. He cannot do other than thus, because that would be wrong of God. That's part of his point, or at least what I hear is his point, is that God is morally obligated to give you free will, or he wouldn't be good. Or if God is good, goodness demands that if I create an independent being from me, they have to have free will. They have to be able to do evil. I have to create them in a way that they can do things that I don't like, or I'm not really giving them freedom. And then when you do give them freedom, they start doing it to do really, really dark, destructive things. That's part of the, it's part of the big package of life.
Yeah, anyone who has some sort of faith in the benevolence of humankind just ought to read The Rape of Nanking.
or
The Painted Bird.
Yeah, or The Painted Bird. That's a good, or Survival in Auschwitz, even better. Yeah. That's the best one. Go ahead.
To add to what Craig said, so yeah, I agree, Craig, that's pretty much what I'm arguing, except that I would use more of the term autonomy than free will. Actually, in my discussion with Ben Watkins, I've developed this point a little bit, and I talk about it more in my writing, but I mean, I think the theodicy is compatible with determinism too, but I'm not a determinist, but I think it can work with determinism too, but I would need to explain why. So.
Interesting. All right. I think we might have like one more question or two. Let's see. There are two types of can't here. One is whether it is within my general capacity. The other is whether my actual cause/effect path takes me there. Yeah, that seems to be responding to my argument against determinism, or the implications of determinism. Now, before Brett has sort of argued, like I've talked to him quite a bit about this before, that it seemed as if he was sort of taking the second position, that there aren't exactly true prescriptive claims, but there are true evaluative claims. So like to say rape is wrong is not to say that we ought not to rape, but rather any instance in which rape occurs is worse than any instance in which a rape does not occur. Like there's an evaluative difference between the two, but not some sort of obligation there. But the two types of can't here, one is whether it is within my general capacity. The other is whether my actual cause/effect path takes me there. I don't know if I understand that exactly. Like if I can't do something, that seems to apply to both of those situations. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Well, it sounds like, if I'm interpreting it properly, that so like compatibilists like to apparently bring up this distinction, like that there are different types of can't. So like they'll say like you can do it under compatibilism. You never would have. I mean, I don't buy it, but that might be what they're getting at.
Yeah, he might be like referring to a conceptual version of can't. Like,
is that in relationship to?
Yeah, go ahead, Craig.
Is that in relation to morals? Because it makes complete sense in relation to morals. There are the things that you can do because you can do them. You are able to do them, and this is actually the root of what Caleb and I were talking about. Just because God allows you free will, okay, doesn't mean you would be capable, nor should you be capable of doing all the things that you are allowed to do, or that you. In other words, you, John, are not that evil. I mean, you're kind of a badass sometimes, but you're not that evil. There's some capable of doing, like just not in your nature to do. Now that should be true of every human being under the sun, but it isn't.
Yeah, so I think that's sort of like what he's getting at.
God is
that there's sort of a difference between things I would never do and then things that I'm physically incapable of doing. So like it may be like I could say I can't eat dog poop because there's no possible world in which I would eat dog poop. But and then there's sort of a difference between that and saying I can't fly 5 feet off the ground because that's like something that is completely like even past my abilities to do that. But I don't know, even within compatibilism, I'm not sure if those are really meaningful distinctions at all.
Right.
But yeah, all right. So that,
oh, you need to understand. John, wait.
No,
because this is actually...
Yeah, you're cutting kind of in and out, but I think
you would not,
what you're saying.
And capable cutting out. What?
Yeah, you sound fine now.
Okay, there was. Well, no, did I just cut out completely?
Yeah, you did. All right, maybe we better wrap up, Craig.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining in on the chat. Thanks Caleb for and Craig for participating with me. And I'll be sure to link your. So do you have it up on Amazon right now?
As yeah, like my book is. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Do you have a title for it?
Yeah, it's God and Natural Evil, and then there's a subtitle: A New Cosmological Argument and New Response to the Problem of Evil. I think that's the full title.
Nice. Awesome. Are you gonna like have some debates regarding it on your channel soon?
I mean, if somebody will debate me, sure. I gotta find somebody.
Yeah.
But we do have a couple of debates coming up on my channel, because at least as of now, Craig and Josh Brister are gonna be debating Steve Tiger next Monday. Apparently that's still happening.
Oh, that's on your channel, yeah.
Yeah, and then on Friday, RC and David Hellman are debating eternal security and being biblical. So
what is eternal security?
So I think it's like once saved, always saved.
Okay, gotcha. All right, cool. Yeah. Thanks everybody for joining us in the chat, and be sure to subscribe to what is it, Apologetic Showdown? Yeah, on YouTube, and also follow him on Twitter and buy his book and use that as your new theodicy, because soul building and free will is out the window. Get the new and improved theodicy.
Wow.
All right. Good night, guys.